his kids bring him Hadley and what's his daughter? Richard, no, his daughter-in-law, yeah. Hadley's. I see them once in a while. And I'm friends with Nancy Whitman. Marlene Whitman, Nancy Whitman.
I got a message, Brian.
How are you?
Sit here.
Good.
See how long this
Get a different perspective in life,
This is
right?
pretty nice. I always sit over there, so.
Jean, this is Neil Morris's daughter, Amy.
Oh,
Yes, because Jean always comes and sits there when she's not, is it Florida?
yeah. Actually, I spoke to you when he passed. And I think I mentioned that he and I once went to New York together. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Lucid.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe I told you that. I knew he was in a but I've never Googled him or anything, so at some point we were thinking of redoing our front story, making it into a porch or something. I was thinking, well, maybe I can ask Bill. And then I looked him up. Yes, and I said, no, that wouldn't be something to ask him about. Oh,
What was this field of expertise?
Most of his century.
He was an architect?
He was an architect.
I'm,
Over 50 homes.
yeah,
Residents.
yeah.
It's so fun.
We don't know what people do.
I've met the Temple that knows very well.
We like Franklin's right a lot. My
Right, it's that.
husband made a whole lot of light screens for our windows.
Yeah,
Right.
along with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we turned
Did you take a couple napkins to rip
a
back?
kind of traditional colonial house. It just had a particular look. It was comfortable, but more modern looking.
I'm good, how are you?
So,
Well,
it was lovely. I just moved out, so still remorse. I'm in Woodhawk. Because I like the location. It's so close to a lot of different things. Here. Actually, my son and their baby moved to Woodhawk Drive, which if you know is 10 minutes walking distance from the condos. That's a big attraction. My granddaughter, right, she's 13 months old and oh, what a sweetheart. They were away for a while, I had to go visit them. I stopped by yesterday. So I have to stop by today. Yeah, she's talking.
Really treasure her because I have two married kids.
It's already in the bulletin.
Oh,
Josh, Josh is 45, married for 10 years. I didn't think that was going to happen at all.
Hi, I'm just sitting here, is this your view? Yes. Okay.
No. No, it's not. It's Jean's seat because she was sitting there.
No, I'm not sitting, I'm in another chair.
That would be fine, yeah.
It was nice talking.
No, here. Sit over here. Jackie's not coming today.
Check on the online.
She's going on to New York, as a matter of fact, with her daughter on Monday. And
Maybe he'll talk about it.
has to go to the concert tonight. Her schedule is too full for Torah Study.
Nice to see you. That's a good news.
Yeah, I'm not gonna sit here. I'm just visiting.
Rabbi Klein, so she gave for it. What a lovely legacy indirectly to me.
Yes, exactly.
So things are changing, coming, going, you see, it's getting slow. But some of the old timers, because they just feel it more convenient, so, you know, was when COVID came, so some people, listen, it's very comfortable to sit in your pajamas and indoors. But there's nothing like, so you're safe for the weekend. Just the weekend. So I got it yesterday. Oh, okay. So you see some more familiar faces. When I came here, I said, I'm the youngster. On the other hand, for me, it's very encouraging that you're there. There was nothing outside there. That was very late 80s and you're
My father's cousins in town.
Yeah, I went to my brother's house.
Yeah. So, the last couple times we got together, very nice. One of my cousins, this is a little deal. Store fixed my cousin off his place.
so it's a problem.
But I didn't hear back from him. That was getting their friends to go. There's no time. You know, we have this every summer.
There was one for the speech that they gave.
Right, exactly. He doesn't there. The one that was,
Yeah.
It's gotta be thinning out.
Speech was done.
We're my kids right now. I said, no, other times I said, give them your daughter. It's the wrong morning, Rabbi.
And then we've got this little
Well, there's something to that. Hopefully in our lifetime. Good morning. How are you?
I am very good, and thank you again so much for the invitation, and I'm delighted to Doris and beautiful. You can, and I will, yes, you may, I will not do that again. I will.
You have to say no.
No, I will make it.
Free all your Saturdays.
I
Knowing
will
which
absolutely,
one I'm gonna.
no, I'm not going to refuse you again. I'll step up. But looking forward to, it's only 2 weeks, but on the count. And a small question here, big deal. Beef or vegan? Is your choice for dinner?
Are those the two choices?
Yes.
I think two beefs.
Great, perfect.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm certainly for myself rather than vegan. I think Jackie, yeah, let's do it too.
It's braised beef,
Well,
and I don't know what it's tofu-ish, so.
No, you know,
And we'll have something if it's.
the food is the
The
least part
thing,
of it.
yes, of course, thank you.
Good, and thank
We're
you.
looking forward, our table is, thank you.
Good.
And enjoy your granddaughters.
Congratulations.
That's very good,
It
yes,
is.
thank you.
Thank you.
And only we would have.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. I just think of when my kids were little and we would have dinner and I would say, let's gather together and talk together, and they were gabbing on their own and so on, which always tickled me. I mean, one wants that among one's children. It reminds, this morning reminds me of that. But I love it. But the conversation, the vitality, I love it. So, nice to see everybody. Couple of things. First of all, thank you to Arthur Kane for sponsoring our bagel table this morning in honor of Stuart Friedman's birthday, which happens to be today. When I talked to Stuart and Arthur just a minute ago, he said that King Charles did him a favor by having the coronation on his birthday.
And Kentucky Derby Day.
Oh my goodness gracious. The goodies keep piling in. So many, many more wonderful birthdays. And Arthur, thank you for doing this. Live streaming, Eric Shaw. Thank you very much, Eric, for sponsoring live streaming. And Candy, I think you picked up this morning. Thank you so very, very much. As I think some of you know, I'm going to not be here next Saturday, and I've asked Doris Donnelly to lead us in our Torah study next week, so I think that'll be a very exciting session. If I said very, very, very exciting, I think that would put too much pressure on you. So let's leave it with very. Okay. But I know all of you will come and have a wonderful session together. So, you know, in the morning when I'm preparing, I have several of these yellow pads. Yellow pads and 3x5 cards are the essence of my rabbinate. If they stop making these and these, I'm hanging it up. And when I grabbed for this one this morning, I noticed there were a couple of things that I had put underneath, and one of them happens to be one of my favorite poems, having nothing to do with Torah study, unless Torah study is most broadly to be defined as wisdom. And the greatest poems tell us something about life. So I was thinking to myself on the way in, should we do the blessing for the study of Torah before I read the poem? And in a sense, in closing this poem by Ben Jonson under the category of Torah? Or should I do the poem first and then the blessing for the study of Torah? I've decided to do the blessing first. And so the poem will provoke us in a way to ask ourselves whether the poem and its wisdom is to be embraced under the broadest definition of Torah, which in a way I think it should, because one of the things that our tradition has long done is to reach out beyond the parameters, the borders, the boundaries of Judaism for wisdom outside of our tradition, and to embrace and to embrace it, to bring it back, and to make it a part of our broader understanding of things. Maimonides himself says in the great discussion of ethics, the Shmona Parakim, the 8 chapters, that it's incumbent upon us to embrace wisdom wherever we find it, so as not to become overly parochial or static, but to continue to draw energy and wisdom from the cultures in which we find ourselves. So I want to read this, the blessing first, I just said that. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. And welcome to those live streaming. So many things to remember at the beginning. So this is a poem by Ben Jonson, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, wrote several important plays, was himself a very important figure. Like the artist Caravaggio, Ben Jonson got himself into a lot of difficulties. I don't think he murdered anybody the way Caravaggio did, but Ben Jonson was an irascible guy. This poem is a sonnet, 14 lines, and the title of it is On My First Son, who died when he was 6, I think. I'm so terribly moved by this poem that I may stumble a little bit. Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? To have so soon scaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. Rest in soft peace and asked, say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. I'm going to say something about the poem, and then I may want to read it again. Notice that last line, and what he loves, that never disappears. May he never like too much, put too much stake in the relationship which he might lose, as what he loves may never like too much. Kind of a, to say it badly, a lesson. I love that line, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry. Wow. And I also love this line, could I lose all father now? He's lost his son. To be a father is to experience loss. He feels that he really should lose it because in a certain way, this is justice. What happens to us is justice. He was lent to me. I'm paying him back, giving him back to God, which is just, exacted by thy fate on the just day. This conflict between a recognition of the realities of life, and we ought to adjust ourselves to those realities. But in order to do it, I would have to lose being a father, which I also can't do. I mean, in just 14 lines, look at all the wisdom and the emotion that he has packed into this poem. I'm going to read it again. Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? To have so soon escaped, to have so soon scaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery, yet age. Rest in soft peace and asked, say, here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such as what he loves may never like too much. Ah, boy. Some people have all the genius, don't they? Okay, so here we are in our Torah portion for this week, Parshat Emor, which begins in Leviticus chapter 20, I think, no, 21. And what I want to do is look carefully at chapter 21 and then think about something that I spoke on last night, and then look at the calendar in chapter 23. We may not get to all of that today. In fact, my money is on not getting to it all. Okay, so this chapter is about the obligations of the priest, and it's divided into two parts. One, the priests, plural, the sons of Aaron, the whole priestly family, the Levites, and then the high priest himself. I said last night that Leviticus is my favorite book of the Bible. And though that may be a slight bit overstated, it's hard to focus on just one book. What about the book of Psalms? What about Isaiah, Genesis, Exodus, Job? But what I love about the book of Leviticus is its attempt to understand what fidelity to one's faith really leads us to think about. How deeply, how authentically, how uncompromisingly is a picture of faith which takes it with extraordinary seriousness. That's what I think the book of Leviticus really does. And it does it in language that is foreign to us, but I think its intensity, its fidelity, its reach is really quite extraordinary. So here we are at chapter 21. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them. So this is the many priests. None shall defile himself for any dead person among his kin, except for the relatives that are closest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, and his brother. Also a virgin sister close to him because she is not married. For her he may defile himself, but he shall not defile himself as a kinsman by marriage, and so profane himself. So what's at stake here? What's at stake is the whole issue of purity in a community. And purity depends upon at least three things: a pure space, a pure cult, ritual, and a pure implementer of that ritual in a pure space. And if any of that is compromised, what we may lose is the presence of God and the sense of the sacredness of our endeavor. And if you think about it, what we're looking for is an ideal. In a way, what we're looking for is a reach toward infinity. The closer to God's holiness, the closer to God, the very source of sanctity, the more sacred our community becomes. We can never reach God's infinity, but we can try very hard to, in priestly terms, live as pure a life as possible in order to be holy as I, the Lord your God, am holy, and to be able to live a life of presence to the sacred. And we have the privilege of being able to implement that. It doesn't happen by fate or by chance. It happens through our actions. This is an empowerment of people. Or as I might say in terms of covenant in the Bible is between two autonomous entities, God and human beings. Human beings are empowered, made in the image of God. And therefore, the sanctity of the covenant depends upon the gifts that God has given us, possibilities, and our capacity to rise to the occasion by doing our part. If you're a prophet and interested in covenant, the same structure applies. God has given us certain things, and it's our obligation to do the right thing, to care for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. The prophets are interested in the ethical component of human obligation. The priestly understanding has the same logic. We have an obligation, but our obligation is to maintain a kind of purity. And the purity of the vehicle of the covenant itself, where God and human beings meet. And if we're going to do this, we have to do it correctly. And the closer we get to purity of the space, of the activity, and of the deliverer of the action, the closer we become to drawing God into our community and therefore having communion with God. For all the problematic aspects from our point of view of the Leviticus, sacrificing animals, blood, and so on, I think the logic of the book of Leviticus is as powerful as a logic with different premises as the prophetic view, or as the view that sacred history and participating in sacred history is a vehicle for sanctity, for purity. Ellen?
What does defile mean?
What's what?
What does defile mean?
Defile means to make impure.
But how do you do that with relatives, or touching them, or?
Because there is a binary reality according to Leviticus, the pure and the impure, and life and death participates in that reality. Death defiles, and to be close to a corpse is both necessary and defiling. Why? I'm going to take a stab at it. Because the emphasis on death keeps us from life, from living fully. You know, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says that the people mourned for Moses 40 days. And one midrash on that is 40 days and then get back to life. If they mourned for Moses for only 40 days, how much the more so should we? Now, that's a bit insensitive to the imponderables of mourning. And when people ask me about that, how long should I mourn? I say to them, you have to do it according to your own sense of things. But it is important, and I say this gingerly without being oppressive, but it is important to return to life and life's opportunities. And I think that has something to do with this. We want to attend to our dead, to our deceased. But those in charge of purity, of a pure sanctuary, who model for us what that means, they themselves cannot be contaminated by proximity to a corpse. We may not accept that logic, but I think that's what's going on here. So the more your responsibility in this system of purity and impurity, the more you have to be protected from those things which contaminate. Now look, I mean, the contamination of a corpse can be understood in two different ways. One, physically, because a corpse does begin to decompose. But also, what I've just said, that it has something to do with the binary opposition between death and life. And that death can consume us and keep us from returning to life wholeheartedly. I think both are at stake here. I don't want to overly philosophize this because I think there are some material realities which also apply. And I'm a little worried about sort of sublimating the realities that are being discussed. But I think that has something to do with it. So let's go back here. So the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, none shall defile himself for any," in my version, the word dead is put in brackets because the word dead is not in the text. Later on it becomes explicit. A nephesh, mate. A mate is a dead person. A nephesh is a person. Nephesh, mate, is a dead person. Here it only has the word nephesh. But it's quite clear what the intention is. Not defile himself or any dead person among his kin. Here, kin means among his own extended family. Except, ki'im, for the flesh of hakarov, the one who is close to him. And I think close has two meanings here. One, proximate, living in the same place, but the other is relative. And here the issue of consanguinity comes into the picture. Blood relative. So not just somebody who lives close, but who is close as a blood relative, with an exception. Except for, none shall defile himself or any dead person amongst him, except for the relatives that are closest to him, in both senses, I think, but certainly the blood relative idea. His mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother. These are all consanguineous relatives. Also for a virgin sister, who is in this category, close to him because she is not married. For her he shall defile himself, but he shall not defile himself as a kinsman by marriage, and so profane himself. So we have two exceptions here that need to be taken care of. One, a sister who is married. She then, by marrying another, leaves the house and enters the house of her husband. And so though she may be close in one sense, she's connected by blood, she's not connected by proximity. So you have a middle case here, and the Torah argues for one of them and not another. She leaves the household. She is no longer the possession, I think this is the language that is appropriate here, the possession of her birth home, but now the possession of her husband and her husband's house. So he now may not mourn for her. Nor, verse 4, he shall not defile himself as a kinsman by marriage. His wife is not a blood relative, and so she is, though now close in the sense of proximity, not close in terms of blood. Okay? So the priests, there are two categories at work here. The priests and the priest. The regular priests and the high priests. The regular priests have permission that the high priest will not have, because it's the high priest that goes into the Holy of Holies, and therefore is the one closest to holiness in its deepest sense. The closer, the less. Let's think of it also in another way. Who am I? Just to take me as an example. I'm, among other things, a rabbi. I also happen to be a person. There's often a conflict between the two. I may want to do something that is not conducive to the role that I play. I was once chastised many, many years ago by a delightful guy, an irascible guy, and I was wearing shorts up at Fairmont Circle. He said to me, "Rabbi, you can't do that. You're the rabbi of the temple." Well, he was making the claim, which in principle I accept, that in a way I have to put aside some of the things Roger Klein, the person, may want to do in recognition of the role that I play, because in a sense I carry, I don't want to overstate this, but I think there's some truth, I carry the dignity, the history, the values of the temple. And I can't deny the fact that though the person may want to do some things, the person playing the role has to be careful about it. So for me, there's an ongoing dilemma. A small d. I mean, I don't worry about it too much. I try to do the right thing. For the priest, it's very clear that he has to totally submerge his identity as a person for the sake of playing a role. Because one of the things a person needs to do as a person is to care for his or her deceased. And the notion of the mate mitzvah, the obligation to bury the dead, to bury our dead, and to accompany the procession to the grave, these are important mitzvot in Judaism. When you think about it, some of my obligations may lead to reciprocity. I love you, love your neighbor as yourself, because one of the things I hope for is that you will love me back. So oftentimes the obligation is not disinterested. It's interested in the sense that I want something in return, which is a human thing. And if I do only the right things, 90% of which I do because I want something back, I've done a lot of good things. Not bad to also help yourself while you're helping others. The notion of, for example, the mitzvah of burying the dead rises in significance because I cannot expect anything back. It is a totally disinterested action. I might feel good about it, but I'm not going to get anything back. So the idea of the certain mitzvot are elevated because there's no reciprocity involved. So burying the dead is a very important mitzvah in Judaism, aside from its psychological importance to us. And yet the priests are forbidden from doing it, which is another way of saying Ploni Almoni, which is John Doe in Hebrew, who happens to be the priest. We say to Ploni Almoni, You cannot think about your own needs or the ambivalences that you might have in life. You've got to put all of that aside because you're playing only a role. And that's why we dress the priest in a uniform. I mean, the word uniform has the notion of unity built into it, doesn't it? And that's because when I put on a uniform, I lose to some degree or another my identity for the sake of being one with the group. That's why the military have to have uniforms, because it's very hard to go into battle unless you have put aside, to whatever degree you can, your own personal needs for the sake of the requirements of the group. So I think that's what's at stake here. At some point in the hierarchy, I might say, of a social organization, there is this imbalance between role and identity. And the more the responsibility, the more the role supersedes the identity in importance. And this is why taking on roles is hazardous. Because you recognize, or will certainly come to recognize, the need for uniformity. How much talk about purity and impurity can we have without bringing baseball into it? So, as we know, the Guardians are not hitting. And one of the critiques is that the players are not willing to take a walk. They're swinging at pitches that they should be taking because they want the glory of, hey, a triple, a home run. But what results from this is they widen the strike zone and they're giving the opposing pitcher more strikeouts than that pitcher should have. Take a walk for the sake of the team. That's what it means to be wearing the uniform. And that's the criticism right now, that they're swinging wildly to satisfy their own individual needs without recognizing what the team needs. Okay, so I think that's what's going on here, and I think for all of its foreignness to us, I think the logic here is extremely powerful. And we know what that is, whether we play a role in a family or in a community or in work. To one degree or another, we have to conform to the principles, the functions of the larger entity in which we find ourselves. And when it concerns purity, the well-being of the community, intimacy with God, the stakes are as high as they possibly can be. And therefore, the need for suppression of identity needs becomes all the more magnified. And as I hear myself saying this, I think to myself, the issue of community health is taken extraordinarily seriously in the book of Leviticus. Malcolm, you had a comment, a question?
Yeah, a comment and a question. You share the burden similarly with King Charles about not wearing shorts at Fairmount Circle.
Yeah.
The question I have is there an admonition or is there a boundary on the side of purity above which man cannot aspire? So you talked about this infinity and approaching this, which we can never, but are there in Leviticus, explicit boundaries beyond which man should desire or attempt to reach?
Which should be bound, we can't reach any higher and we want to know this, something like that?
Yeah.
Is that your point? I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, it would be, I'm going to take a quick stab at an answer, and then I'm going to admit that I don't have one. If I'm thinking about, think of a graph, and think about an asymptote. That is, if you're dealing with the first quadrant here, and you have a line that is, I think it may be 1 times 1, x times y equals 1, where the larger x becomes, as I move along x, the smaller y becomes, and at some point, it's infinity, it's over 0. I've approached and completely come to that line. That's what's called an asymptote. That line can go on forever because I never reach infinity. I never reach the end of it. So if you think of that line as continuous, this is my basic point, there is no upper limit until infinity, because that line is not broken. So I think one answer is no. There are no limits to how high we can reach. I think the other answer requires now a close read of the book of Leviticus to see whether or not there are limits imposed on one endeavor or another. And for that, I don't know the answer.
I understand what you're saying, but I think of, in the biblical, I think of Adam and Eve's, and maybe I'm mixing the sacred and the profane, but reaching for the tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
Or in contemporary circumstances, our artificial intelligence now creating something that's nearly godlike. Yeah. And to me, those are, again, maybe I'm mixing, as I say, mixing sacred and profane, but is there instruction from a religious point of view about where man should not go, must not go?
Right. I think the answer, though I really feel I have very few resources to answer this question, is no prima facie limit. I mean, what does it mean that you've eaten the tree of knowledge and this is a problem? I don't think the Torah wants to say that knowledge itself isn't good. We're given a mind and so on. I think what it's saying to us is there is a knowledge beyond which we should not go, because there are some things we can't know. Okay? So there are mysteries that can't be penetrated. So I don't know that the Garden of Eden thing is a good answer to your question, because in a certain way, a continuum is laid before us. And in an indefinite way, there's something problematic about knowing too much or getting inside God's head. So what we need to look for are explicit statements about limits. And we could do that, but I don't know. Clearly, Job. Job says, you remember the speech out of the whirlwind at the end of the book of Job? Where were you when I created the world? Where were you when I created the rock badger, who has a full life in the crags of mountains, in places you will never see, you can't get to? There are limits to what you do, and those limits don't apply to me because I created the whole thing. So who are you to bring me to trial and ask me about justice? So the book of Job definitely articulates the idea of limit, but in vague terms. Yeah. Okay. So good. Let's please.
What you're talking about, is that in the Kabbalah? Why are we supposed to stay away from the Kabbalah? Is that the book of mysteries?
Yeah. So the question is, why are we enjoined to stay away from Jewish mysticism, the secrets of Jewish mysticism? And I don't think that there is a general interdiction. It's just, don't do it until you're married and reach the age of 40, something like that. You've got to be settled enough in life and have had enough experience in order to be able to put in perspective some of the radical comments of mysticism, such as Maimonides says that the notion of God is one fundamentally is talking about God who is a unity and has no parts. Because once you have God having parts, you can begin to divinize those parts. And so having complexity in the Godhead is a problem. And mysticism talks about the parts of God. It talks about the suffering of God. That part of the function of the mitzvot for the Kabbalah is to help repair the alienation that God experienced from himself in the creation of the world. Just as the Jews are in exile, so too is God in exile. Because for certain elements of the Kabbalah, the creation of the world was not as Genesis 1 thinks of it, as the putting together of the various parts in a harmonious whole one day after another. Creation was catastrophe. And the catastrophe struck God most of all. And the function of the commandments is, if you can believe this, to help save God from self-exile. Seriously? I mean, I don't see anything like that in the Bible or in the Mishnah or in the Talmud. So mysticism in its speculative, not in its practical form, although I've run in both, can be understood as extremely dangerous. To introduce, after all, if I'm not mistaken, the Trinity introduces three parts of God. And I take it that for the church, the mystery, how the three are one, is a mystery. God manifests himself in different ways. Well, look, to Judaism, that is deeply problematic. We don't accept that. But the mysticism that I've just tried to lay out does accept it. Is this the impact of Christianity? Or let us even say Gnosticism, which is a very important movement in the early Christian period, maybe preceding it, where there are two gods. According to the Gnostics, the real God never makes an appearance in the Old Testament. That is the God of vengeance. The real God doesn't manifest God's self until the New Testament for Christian forms of Gnosticism. But in any event, Gnosticism accepts the notion of at least a dualism. This is also problematic. But the mysticism does introduce plurality into the very being of God. And that creation, far from being a blessing, and God said that it was so, and God blessed them and said, and so on. For Genesis 1, creation is a blessing. We blew it to some degree with Adam and Eve, which created the other side of creation. The blessing of creation never ends, according to biblical religion, but human nature introduces complexity and problems. Now, to think of creation not as a blessing, but as catastrophe, so think of all the elements of the mystical temper that challenge rabbinic Judaism. And therefore, though it may be very profound, after all, think about the notion of exile. We suffered in the exile. Certainly there were golden periods, but the late Middle Ages was very catastrophic for the Jewish people, starting in 1492, 1391, with the pogroms in Spain. So that the chosen people is suffering centuries of exile. Where is God? Why is the chosen people suffering so much? Here's an answer. God's in exile too. Creation created the exile of God from God's self, so that we share something with the very source of all being and meaning in the universe. The Jewish people, therefore, are playing a cosmic role, and exile is one of the important elements in the cosmic role that the Jewish people play. And just as we can say something about how God can reunify, so we have hope that the career of the Jewish, think of it this way, this is God's career, this is the career of the Jewish people. In 1492, we're both in exile, in 1592. But we can help God regain his unity, so this career is going to arrive at a better and better state. Ours will too, because our career mirrors God. To have God in exile brings dignity, not less suffering, but dignity to the suffering of the Jews in exile. Because it's a cosmic element. It's not just the bad guys put us into exile. It's that this is the career of entities in history. When I'm 18, I have no idea who I am, and I'm searching for meaning. Don't go there. You're not ready. Only when you settle down and understand some of the realities of life and have a stake in the life that you lead. You know, if I'm in college and I want to leave college and go do something else, it's not that hard as an action. If I want to do the same thing when I'm married and have a family and I have a job, it's harder. I'm more stable. I'm less likely to be reckless. Don't read the stuff which will increase your doubt and your skepticism about the dictates of Rabbinic Judaism. That's why, I think. Okay, let's go back. Gershom Scholem's Main Trends in Jewish Mysticism is a book to read. It's one of the great classics. Even, the Christian Century, I don't think the Christian Century is published anymore. Is it, Doris, at all? Martin Marty from the University of Chicago was its longtime editor. And when Martin Marty, at the end of the 20th century, reflected on the most impactful books. Now, this is a Christian historian, theologian in a Christian journal. Said that Scholem's Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism is one of the greatest books of the century. I can't help but telling you an anecdote about it. So, Scholem gave these lectures. They were first lectures at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I've said this before, but it's worth saying again, I think. And he was introduced by Shaul Lieberman, who was one of the great Talmudists of the 20th century, and a rationalist Talmudist, not a Chassid, but a mitnaged, an opponent to Chassidism. And Shaul Lieberman, in his introduction to Scholem's great lectures, said the following: "We all know that Jewish mysticism is nonsense, but scholarship, but the study of Jewish mysticism is scholarship." Okay, the thing itself is nonsense, but talking about it, research on it is. So he was really, I think, articulating the idea that I suggested. It's nonsense, and it's certainly not for children. Okay, let's go back. Where are we? So, now verse 5. He shall not shave smooth any part. They shall not shave smooth any part of their heads. So, these are mourning, M-O-U-R, mourning rituals in some pagan societies. So if you're going to be pure, don't introduce foreign elements. There's something powerful about self-denial when you're mourning. Don't do it. Don't make gashes in your flesh. Another pagan mourning ritual. I like to use the word pagan as a mere descriptive term for not Jewish. It's not an evaluative term for me. It's just the way others do it. Here, it's certainly, it's got, I don't know. Is this a critique of pagan rituals, or is it just a way to keep us from compromising our own beliefs? Which doesn't mean that those beliefs are inherently problematic. They may just be problematic for us. If you want to introduce the clock into Major League Baseball, be careful. This comes from another place. Verse 6, they shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the Lord's offerings by fire, the food of their God, and so must be holy. So notice how fascinating this is. They can't profane themselves because they are the ones who implement the rituals through which God enters the community. So be very careful. They're the ones who do this. But then we have this very problematic idea of the food of their God, and so must be holy. So what do we have here? We may have a kind of atavistic, a remnant of the less rationalized idea that God doesn't need food. That we're doing it, the smoke does rise as if God is accepting it. But it's not, God isn't accepting it because God needs us to feed him. The way in which the Babylonian idea of why human beings are created. In the Babylonian idea, the gods need to be fed, so they create human beings to feed them. And that's not a normative idea here. If we were, why don't we look quickly at Psalm 50. Psalm 50. You can go there with me or just let me read it to you. I'm looking at Psalm 50, verse 7. Pay heed, my people, and I'll speak. O Israel, I'll arraign you. I am God, your God. I censure you not for your sacrifices and your burnt offerings made to me daily. I claim no bull from your estate, no he-goats from your pens. For mine is every animal in the forest, the beasts on 1,000 mountains. I know every bird of the mountains, the creatures of the fields are subject to me. Were I hungry, I would not tell you, for mine is the world and all it holds. So don't think that you are necessary to feed me. I don't need to be fed. But were I to need food, I would get it myself. So I think of the transition or the difference between these two things as the possible difference between a more primitive idea where God does need food to its elimination later through a psalm that is being polemical against that very idea. You think I need food. That's the logic of Psalm 50. You think I need food. I'm going to argue against it, God is saying. So that the presumption of these verses in the psalm is that it's plausible, maybe even powerful, to think God needs food. And I'm going to tell you, no, it's not the case. So, look, that can be a kind of metaphor, food, not literally in the Leviticus passage, but it also could be the bursting in of a remnant from a pre-monotheistic universe. See what I mean? I don't know what to make of it, but I think it's very, I think it's very fascinating. Verse 7, Leviticus 21. They shall not marry a woman defiled by harlotry, nor shall they marry one divorced from her husband. For they are holy to their God, and you must treat them as holy, since they offer the food of your God. They shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. So, a woman who has been a harlot or already married, the assumption is, let's just say it and then maybe retreat from it, defiles. Harlotry defiles, and when you've been married to another man, you have been defiled in some sense, which we can understand even if we don't use that loaded word, right? And so this is another way of maintaining the purity of the priests. I'm not going to argue real strongly for it, but you can see what's going on here. Certain kinds of activities defile, and the priest, and therefore the cult, must be kept pure. Michael?
Yes, and here it's talking about they offer the food of your God, but then later those who have a defect may eat of the food of your God, but not offer the food of your God. And I was wondering if you could explain the difference between those two.
Between the eating and the offering? Well, look, so the priests have a vocation. They are serving the cult. They're not farmers. They're not merchants who on their own and through their own vocation can get their own emoluments, their own wherewithal. When you're serving the cult and can't leave that vocation or that space, where are you going to get your food? Where are you going to get the wherewithal to live a life? You can't make it. So it's got to be enclosed or connected to the cult itself. And the idea here is that just because you have been defiled by some action or another doesn't mean you lose your salary. I think that's the idea. That would be cruel. You can no longer eat. Well, how am I supposed to live? Well, that's your problem, not mine. So there is a kind of concession here to the realities of what it means to serve the cult. Yes, and you must treat them, verse 8, as holy, since they offer the food of your God. They shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. There's that idea again, that the source of holiness, not only the source, but the standard of holiness is God. When you have God in your system, you have introduced infinity into your system, and therefore infinite striving as well. It's a system which places perfection within the system, but also encourages people to strive to emulate that perfection. What two better things could a community want to have? The reality of perfection and the imperative to strive toward it. When a daughter, verse 9, of a priest defiles herself through harlotry, it is her father whom she defiles. She shall be put to the fire. Ay, ay, ay. But family obligations to the vocation of the priest, which is the vocation of the community. The priest who is exalted above his fellows, on whose head I got to focus on this. The priest who is exalted above his fellows. So this is now the high priest, the one priest, who is exalted above his fellows, and here's how we illustrate this, on whose head the anointing oil has been poured. So the anointing oil is only poured on the head of the high priest and not of all the other priests. And who has been ordained to wear the vestments. So the high priest has different clothing, or at least additional clothing, to the regular priest. So the hierarchy is, let's say, threefold. You and I, the priests, the high priest. And the high priest's singularity is illustrated materially in the oil being poured, so we all see it, and the vestments. Every time the high priest goes to the corner, we see, that's the high priest. Shall not bare his head or rend his vestments, end of verse 10. He shall not go in where there is any dead body. Any dead body. He shall not defile himself even for his father and his mother. Notice the deprivation. You and I can deal with our deceased and be a part of this, both emotionally and serving them. One of the great mitzvot is you honor your father and your mother even when they are dead. That's the idea here, not just when they are living. You and I get to do that. The priests get to do it, but for a very limited number of people. So that the deprivation, the self-denial, is limited for the priests, but it's total for the high priest. The high priest can't mourn at all. So great is the high priest's responsibility to the purity of the cult. Only the high priest, and only on one day, gets to go into the Holy of Holies. Talk about a responsibility. That's why he wears the little bells, so he doesn't get consumed. You know, if he gets consumed in the Holy of Holies, at least the bells ring and they go in and they get him, I guess. That's part of the idea here. So verse 11 again, he shall not go in where there is any dead body. He shall not defile himself, even for his father or mother. He shall not go outside the sanctuary and profane the sanctuary of his God, for upon him is the distinction. I think the word for distinction here is nazer, which is devotion. The difference, the Nazarite has devoted himself or herself, women can do it too, to, for a special period, devote him or herself to the thoughts about God, the obligations to God. Doesn't shave his head, doesn't drink wine, doesn't go to a dead body. But the thing about the Nazarite, is that the period of being a Nazarite must come to an end. And part of the ritual of ending his Nazarite is to bring a sin offering, from which the rabbis infer that self-denial is a problem. Certain people who take certain vows, they can do it for a limited time. But there's something very problematic about self-denial in a world which has been sanctified and blessed by God. So even the person who is devoting him or herself has to be careful not to be swept away in this, hey, I didn't just fast on Yom Kippur. I fasted a second day. I fasted Yom Kippur on Tuesday. I fasted on Wednesday. I'm so devout, I even fasted on Thursday. Yeah. Now I was in some pain Friday from not eating for 3 days, but I want to tell you, my devotion to God does not have limits. You're not devout, you're a fool, right? I mean, too much devotion is a problem. A woman who is pregnant on Yom Kippur and who is having some physical difficulties not only can eat, she must eat. Because life transcends anything but the big three: idolatry, adultery, and murder. So it doesn't say so here, but the whole notion of the Nazarite from this word devotion has its limits. Don't you love that idea? That even something so praiseworthy as fidelity can be taken too far. That leads you to deny other things. Let's continue. Verse 12. He shall not go outside the sanctuary and profane the sanctuary of his God. For upon him is the destination of the distinction of the anointing oil of his God. Not sure I understand that. Mine, the Lord's. Maybe it's because he alone has, the oil is a symbol, a tangible symbol of the highest form of devotion. And if you go outside the sanctuary, you may be defiling it. I'm not sure I get it. He may only marry a woman who is a virgin. A widow or a divorced woman, or one who is degraded by harlotry, such he may not marry. Only a virgin of his own kin. Here I think kin is not family, but community. So the word this is mav, has different reference, more narrowly at the beginning, broader. Here. That he may not, verse 15, profane his offspring among his kin, for I, the Lord, have sanctified him. And then we get into a bunch of details, which are, it's sort of problematic how far the author takes this. The Lord spoke further to Moses, speak to Aaron, and say, no man of your offspring throughout the ages who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the food of his God. No one at all who has a defect shall be qualified. No man who is blind or lame or has a limb too short or too long. No man who has a broken leg or a broken arm or is a hunchback or a dwarf, who has a growth in his eye, who has a boil scar, scurvy, or crushed testicles. No man among the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall be qualified to offer the Lord's offering by fire. Having a defect, he shall not be qualified to offer the food of his God. He may eat of the food of his God, this is, Michael, what you were pointing to, of the most holy as well as of the holy, but he shall not enter behind the curtain or come near the altar, for he has a defect. He shall not profane these places sacred to me, for I, the Lord, have sanctified them. Thus Moses spoke to Aaron and to his sons and to all the Israelites. So from verse 16 on, we get the point, don't we? It's the logic of perfection. You're going to deal with a perfect God. You're trying to make the sanctuary and the community perfect, perfectly clear. And therefore, those who implement this have to be perfect themselves. And they've got a very somatic, bodily view here of one of the aspects of perfection, right? I think one of the things Freud said about ritual is it can get to be very obsessive and become a psychological malady. Here I think we're a little close, aren't we? I mean, to what extent of detail are you going to take this? So the author, I'm thinking of myself, I'm thinking about the author who's writing this, whoever he or she or they, including maybe God, was on a roll in this chapter, right? I mean, the momentum had gotten so strong that this person couldn't stop himself. Don't write crushed testicles. Yeah, Candy?
Well, if Aaron was head of the priestly class and clan, who is the high priest? Moses was not a high priest, was he?
No.
And so who is the high priest and how did he get there? Do we know of any individuals in the Bible that were high priests?
Well, look, there's certainly, in King David's time, there are two different high priests. I hope I'm right about this. There's Eviatar, and there's also Tzadok. So they're the Tzadokites and the Eviatarites. Eviatar was a descendant of Eli, whose sons, Hophni and Pinchas, violated the cult by not doing the sacrifices before they ate. They just took their forks and grabbed what they wanted. And so God said in the early chapters of Samuel that Eli's priesthood will come to an end. And it comes to an end when David decides, I think I'm right about this, on Tzadok as the high priest and not Eviatar. So, and by the way, Eviatar is exiled to Anatot, where Jeremiah was born. So Jeremiah comes from a family that had been exiled by the high priesthood, and according to what's his name, Richard Elliott Friedman, Jeremiah has a huge role in the writing of the Bible that comes from this exiled family. How fascinating is that? So I think, Candy, the answer to your question is, without being able to really fill in the continuities, that there's a history of the high priesthood and different houses that are vying for control, and as happens in history, one of them prevails, probably through machinations. I mean, I doubt if they went to the temple and said, "Dear God, tell us who." So that suggests to me by implication that down through, as long as there's a temple, there's a high priesthood. And after the exile, it's really the priests who run things. After the exile, there's no return of the monarchy. There are a few prophets, but it's a theocracy until the second temple is destroyed. By the way, just to finish the logic here, do we want a third temple? Yeah, absolutely we want a third temple. Otherwise, we don't have a pure community. Because until you have a pure space and a pure sacrifice by recognized individuals, you are in spiritual exile. Of course we want a third temple. That's the logic, isn't it? I mean, I certainly don't want a third temple. That'd be World War III. But the power of that notion cannot be dropped by those who really buy into this entire worldview. Yeah, Gary.
This may be a small point, but the statement is only a virgin of his own kin may he marry. The reality of that is concerning, isn't it? That he has to marry within his own, that means a brother, that means a sister, for example.
See, I think here that the word kin, community, can have different reference. So that at the beginning, verse 1, none shall defile himself or any dead person among his kin, that clearly, and it certainly as it goes on to define them, is his own nuclear family. Here, I think you raise a problem for maintaining that narrow definition. And therefore, one can infer, I think it's only inference, that since the word itself allows for elasticity, Am Yisrael, that's the whole Jewish people, that we're going to give it the interpretation that doesn't really create a huge problem for understanding. I mean, some interpreter said at some point, there's going to be a rheumatologist who's going to come and raise this question. So let's preempt the question. Is broader to be broader understood here. Yeah, yes. Okay. Jim.
We're talking about the hierarchy, and I think it's necessary for society to have a hierarchy. But isn't there a little danger here that with the high priest, that the community will see him other than a person? I mean, he's got to do his role 24/7, and so he's probably lost all identity as a person. So that's his problem, but the community may look at him as, since he's in this hierarchy, as a step above the rest of them, which he sort of is, but he's still a person. So doesn't that get to a little bit of a problem in terms of thou shalt have no other God before me? And also the community may assume this guy knows everything, which he doesn't. He's just another person.
So I think that's an interesting point, but I think that your concern is taken care of in a variety of ways. One, he's not a community guy. He can't come outside the sanctuary and say, by the way, no red lights on that corner. I mean, he has no secular political role. So the self-enclosure, I think, limits his power. Absolute, perhaps, in that space, but that space, however crucial it is, isn't the whole space of the community and all of its needs. Secondly, it's quite clear that his role is as a servant. He is serving the community by serving God. So that, if your function is already decided, and that is an absolute, and in that sense, you're an officiant doing a job. So I think those things. Now, if he comes out of the Holy of Holies or the sacred space and says, we should have 2 houses of Congress, not 1. People would say, what gives you the right to talk about that? Go back in there and do what you're doing. So I think you make an interesting point about the higher the person in the hierarchy, the more dangerous. An absolute ruler is kind of the divine right of kings in a certain way is what you're talking about. Doesn't, I don't think, apply here, but the king who feels that he or she, queen, chosen by God and therefore has rights inherent in the office given by God, now you've got a problem. But I don't think that applies here.
No, my concern was with not of the persons, of what the community thought of this person. But maybe a step above being a person.
No, I get that. But how would the community interact with the priest? I mean, they can't ask him any questions. They see that he's enclosed in this space. I think the chances of divinizing him are few. I think so. Joan?
I'm disturbed by what is considered perfection, and that it relates only to physical characteristics and not character.
So Joan's asking what are the criteria of perfection, and how they seem here is to be all physical, not character, not values, how you live your life, and so on. Maya, you have a comment?
Yeah, when you said perfection, I thought that the real word is purity, because this is about purity.
Yeah. Right, but purity, there's a continuum of purity, right? And there can be the highest form of purity. Well, that's an interesting point. The priest remains human, but has to maintain his purity in all forms. This gets back to your question. I'm trying to circle back to your question. But the criteria of being a pure deliverer of the cult is physical. The assumption, I suppose, is that once the person becomes a high priest, that he will be devoted to the purposes of the priesthood, but it doesn't say, and here's how you can do this with perfection. It doesn't talk about the mode of the activity. It certainly doesn't talk about the attributes of the priest. In a certain way, if I'm leading a service and I do the Aleinu at the beginning and then the Shema after, I don't understand my role. My role is to deliver the call, just put it in these terms. And if I do it right, I can't follow this logic myself. I was going to say, if I do it right, and what I'm about is my role, that's enough. Do you need to know who I am as a person? Well, sure. That adds to whatever trust or whatever you place in the clergy. So I was trying to make a case for that playing the role correctly is enough. And that's the challenge of your question. What about the character? And yeah. If I'm merely defined by, does the Bible care what the priest does outside? Is there an outside for the priest? I don't know. No, it raises a very interesting question. I can tell if a person has, blemish, let's say. I can see it. If you think that the person is a liar, well, there are different kinds of lies or why. It becomes a little bit ambiguous. And we don't want ambiguity. Physical signs are not ambiguous. Something like that, but I think your challenge is it's both interesting and I think revealing that somehow character doesn't matter. You're the son of a priest, you're a priest. That's the end of the matter. You're the daughter of a priest, you're not a priest. You may be a much better person, but you can't be a priest. And that's something to reckon with, I think, because role, yeah, Harry.
Who appoints the high priest and who appoints the priests? You mentioned before that in David's time there was a conflict between two high priests.
Yeah.
That being so, how can they both be appointed by God?
So in chapter 8 of Leviticus, which is about the anointment of the priest, Moses does it. Moses generates the priesthood, and after that it runs by itself, doesn't it? The children succeed the father. If there are more than one children, I guess it's the oldest child. Here my particular knowledge runs out. So I think that it follows, let me back up. The priesthood has a history, and its terms, I think, change down through time. So that, is it Solomon who anoints the high priest? Yeah. It's Moses at the beginning, and then it runs on its own. But I don't know what happens after that. See, that would be a great thing to look up, and believe me, I'm going to do it. Just what's the history of the priesthood? Yeah. I mean, I think in the biblical book of Hebrews, am I right about this? That Jesus is recognized as the high priest. So there is a kind of transformation or another stage of the history of the priesthood. Because the priesthood, through the priest's actions, renders the altar pure. Doesn't Jesus, through his actions, bring a kind of purity to the lives of the people now? Even if I'm still living a life, something fundamental has happened to me through Jesus' redeeming death. So Jesus can be understood as playing a priesthood role, which I think it's been a long time since I read Hebrews, but place. So that's another element in the history of the priesthood. And you raised the question about that. I'm going to get back to you on this. Yeah. Carol.
The congregation that I grew up in outside New York City, they hired a rabbi when I was a child, and I remember this. The rabbi walked with a limp. And I do remember hearing older members of the congregation saying, we can't hire him, that, you know, the rabbi can't be walking with a limp, you know, the Bible says that.
Oh, gosh, really?
And he was a wonderful, wonderful.
Very good. Yeah. Oh, they really said the Bible says that. Because in a way, that's a category mistake, isn't it? I mean,
He was a rabbi, he wasn't a priest.
the rabbi's not a priest. That was a very different role, and has a very different history. So, I mean, but that's a stunning thing to say, because there was that idea that some sort of physical imperfection. And he got his comeuppance, so to speak, by being a great rabbi. That would be kind of Joan's point here, that it's not so much the physical as something of the characterological. Michael?
But what is it about the physical defects that are mentioned here that would prevent the priest or the high priest from doing their role?
I don't think it's meant to impede the role, but to qualify the purity of the person who is doing the role.
So because this life and death are polar opposites, and having some kind of physical, quote, defect, unquote, is somehow in the middle there. It's evading the dichotomy.
No, I think it really creates another dualism, pure and impure.
Oh, pure, okay.
And you can't be in the middle there. You know, he has a defect, and therefore he doesn't qualify for the purest of the pure, is what I'm inferring here. Yeah, Jordan?
The sacrifices the animals have to be without blemish, and they inspect them before it's possible to be a sacrifice, including a red heifer without blemish.
Very good. So Jordan makes the point that if you look at the various aspects of this whole operation, the animals, we haven't talked about that yet, also have to be pure. I think they have to be a year old in the sense that they're still of great vitality and usefulness, so you're really making a sacrifice. If I've got a lamb that's, 100 years old and doesn't have any more, well, what kind of sacrifice is that? So the purity idea applies down the list of elements. Stuart?
With Carol's point, I was on the board of another congregation in Cleveland, and we evaluated potential rabbis. A woman who wore a yarmulke in the synagogue was deemed unacceptable as a rabbi.
Interesting.
I don't know whether it was because she was a woman or because she wore a yarmulke, which was the excuse that was given.
Because wearing a yarmulke for traditional Judaism is the mixing of categories.
Yeah.
Men wear yarmulkes. A woman that wears a yarmulke is sort of a hybrid, and we want pure categories. That could be the logic behind it if they weren't clear on it. What year was this?
It had to be probably 15 years ago.
Okay. That's still fairly recent, but I'm not saying that you did it in 1920. But still, that sounds like
By the way,
something.
I opposed it.
I'm sorry?
I opposed that.
You opposed it. Good for you. Good for you. So at that point, a woman was a possible candidate who was nixed by this.
Correct.
Yeah. Interesting. Ron?
Going back to Jimmy's question, it was a rather long discussion. It seemed that the discussion and Jimmy's question was from the perception of the layman through going upwards towards the high priest. I fear the high priest's role. If I understand it, he is the communicator for the entire community. He talks to God, God talks to him, he reports what God said. community has to accept what comes down as being God's rule. So if we have a question about cation, if we have a question about marriage, if we have a question about the rights of inheritance, we go to the priest, and the priest goes to the higher priest, and ultimately the high priest goes to God. The answer comes down. Doesn't that high priest really become the primary authority and the ruler?
The high priest is not adjudicating issues or cases. You say...
He is ultimately asking God what the answer is. And God tells him, and then that becomes the rule.
Yeah. You know, I don't know the answer to your question. That is, we'd have to look more carefully now at these texts to see whether or not the priest has any duties other than bringing the sacrifice and staying pure. Whether he adjudicates cases. So the answer depends upon the evidence. I don't know of any, I'm certainly no expert in this stuff, and we'd have to go back into Chronicles. I think that also talks about these things a little bit. So I don't know the answer to it. My sense is that it's a circumscribed vocation and not all of this. By the way, the community is going to accept, because we do have a quite clear hierarchy. I mean, look, when the President of the United States is inaugurated, prima facie, we're going to honor, we're going to say, we have a a divided government. So we have Congress and we have the Supreme Court. But the prima facie, that is, we take very seriously that he's been voted in and that there's a ceremony of inauguration. Now, it's possible, I know it's remote, but it's possible that a president might not do honor to his office. I know it's remote. But I think that's all, it's not exactly kidding aside. But there is something about an official ceremony which under general circumstances, I mean, if the society is in chaos, that sort of thing, is accepted, not in any absolute way, but, the so-called honeymoon period, which, may have worked in more Pacific times and so on. But whether or not the priest has other duties is a question. Maya?
Just to go back to the story of purity, I think that having improper procedures or something is going to sully the name of God. And I think that if you are not doing the perfect thing, you imply that this God is not worthy of worshiping because you can get away with, inferior stuff.
I'm not following your point here.
If you are not pure or the sacrifice is not pure, it implies that maybe God is not himself that pure because he's accepting these inferior offerings. So it's bearing on the quality or the identity of God.
That's an interesting point. So Maya is saying that, in a way, not the purity of God per se, but the perception of the purity of God depends upon human beings. If we compromise on the purity of the activity and the sacrifice goes up to God, it's going to go up whatever you do, that may suggest that God's self, is accepting something impure and therefore impure God's self. So that, and I wanted to point out something at the end of chapter 22, which I talked about last night, then maybe we'll get to it at some point, about how, let's take a look at it very quickly. I know our time is quickly running out. I'm looking at chapter 22, verse 31. I won't go on and on about it, but just to make the point, because I think it reflects what Maya is saying. 22:31. You shall faithfully observe my commandments. See it? I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. God's sanctification depends upon us. The word sanctify, the verb sanctify, is in the passive voice here. That I may be sanctified among the people. So that in this sense, I think it reflects Maya's point, that what the people do can reflect upon who God is. And if it's done imperfectly or impurely, and it nevertheless goes up, the sacrifice, so God's reputation, I think this is the idea, is in our hands by what we do, because God's not going to come out and say, hey, you got that wrong. So God has been, but precisely because God has no body, God can't speak. The camera's going to shut off in 2 minutes. Lynn?
Isn't the role of a high priest just to service God, that he doesn't service the people? So the only way you can decide who the high priest would be by your understanding of what is a pure person physically, and if he has certain roles to fulfill to service God, he doesn't enter into society or enter into social things. So we're talking about, why don't we know his character? Is he going to make things impure because he has a bad character? If there's rules to service God and certain traditions to service God, isn't that what the high priest does? He only services God.
He only serves God, and by serving God, he serves the people.
Right, okay. That's all I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Because then some things are answered that we discussed.
Yeah, well, I think that's the general structure here. And by the way, it's interesting in this regard that the priesthood is inherited. It's not chosen. You're not looking for, all who have the following criteria apply for the priesthood. We'll decide. No. It's taken out of the hands of choice and therefore attributes. If you're the eldest son of the high priest, you're the high priest. You can blow it, as Nadav and Abihu did early on. You remember that? They brought a strange fire before God. You can blow it. Or Eli's sons blew it. So, yeah, but they get there not because we like their CV. Which makes it more, it takes it out of the realm of criteria and attributes. Next week, Doris is going to lead the session, and enjoy. I know it'll be a stimulating session. I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Shabbat Shalom. Kathy, we wish you would poetry. You'll be back. Good. We'll try to save the best poems.
I'm just here for the weekend. I do, yeah, brother or sister. Ready to go?
see her easier.
I'm sorry.
Good to see you.
When are you going back?
Tomorrow night. They're good. She's good. She'll be here. She'll probably be here for a week. 'Cause that's also. Yeah, the next weekend is yours. The next weekend is the.
Yeah, here.
Yep. Yes, yes. We have another one.
Oh, I
The guy who's supposed to be next weekend. Yep. And do you want to come to, what's today?
Are you coming next week?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay. We're doing 3 to 4 a day, I think.
Maybe.
I've never been in my grandmother's old place, the first one that he designed.
I understand. I know. Yeah, I know.
So that might be one you have. Yes, yep, exactly. Are you, yep, so I'll let you know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I know, my emails are I told her I was like, it was my birthday.
March.
I know. That's right. Yes. Yes, absolutely, exactly.
That's the best way of saying it.
Yes.
That, to me, the paradigm of that is
Oh, yes, that's exactly. No, this will solve it.
yes, he continues to live in our
Yes, he
hearts.
does. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Okay, I've had this question for weeks, and I didn't want to take up time. So the Holy of Holies, lots of blood there all the time.
The blood wasn't. I think the blood took place out in the outer court.
But it was onto the,
Does it say so? Does it?
yeah,
Does
the
it-
blood
okay.
on the posts.
Okay. Oh, the posts. I see what you're saying. Okay, good.
They
Yes.
splattered blood all over. Who cleans it? I mean,
Who cleans it?
I mean, years. Who can go in there and clean it? Does the priest? I mean, you can see why I didn't want to ask this. It's
You
so,
know, yeah. I mean, one could say if it were outside the Holy Holies, they hired some people to do it. But in the Holy Holies, nobody gets to go in there.
so the priest must have stood there and did their duties.
Yeah, you know.
I mean, really. Somebody has to clean it.
You know, one literary scholar makes an interesting point that in telling a story, no matter how many details you fill in, there are always more that you can't. And so his point was there's always room for commentary and asking questions about what about this, what about that. This may be, I mean, I don't know all the literature, there's a lot of stuff being written about this. If I was adept at this literature, I probably could give you an answer, but I don't know.
I think I should ask the librarian. Does she do research?
She probably can. We can all do Google. We can ask ourselves who cleaned the blood in the Holy of Holies. That might blow up Google.
No, I'm just thinking.
You may get an AI answer.
You may get an AI answer.
But you may
Come
or
back
may
to me when
not
I'm
be-
more developed.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, no, but it's not only a particular question, it has a general thing, because there must be details that aren't discussed, and we could ask them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good, you come up with it. I'm the first person.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that the next time somebody asks
I
me,
did it anyway. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I mean,
In last week's online Temple News, it says there's no meeting next week.
I know it does.
Are we going to retract that?
I have to retract, that's a good point. I did retract it in something, but I'm going to have to for the next communication.
Yeah. We'll all be next communicated.
If you don't come, if those who don't come, yeah, I'll be taking the names.
Yeah. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks. Hello.
So two small things. You know, I agree on the purity issue. We have to have the unblemished calf. We also need to have pure fire, alien fire. No reason that the priest shouldn't be pure. And plus, they're giving us a checklist. I think that's really helpful. So I think you have a very 21st century biased cultural perspective on this is problematic because they don't want any dwarfs or people with defects.
And your point,
it's very consistent with the whole Leviticus thing that the priest should be as pure as what's being sacrificed and the fire being used to sacrifice it.
I get the logic of it.
You're either in it or you're not in it. You're being selective. I'm immersing myself in it selectively, right?
I think I'm thinking a little differently about it. I mean, I certainly would say what you've said.
Yeah.
I get that this is just part of the whole, and it flows from the premises.
Yeah.
All has to be pure. I guess I am thinking a little bit of the Freud critique that obsessive compulsive behavior, and when you get to that level of detail, I get the point.
But you're not applying that Freud critique to other areas of Leviticus. You're saying, hey, look, it's just saying how devout we are, how important this is. So I would say apply it all the time. You're applying it selectively.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it's so picky, and I didn't want to bring it up in front of everybody.
Right. If you're going to make a case for Leviticus,
make the case and don't bring other worldviews
No,
in.
or if you're gonna bring in Freud, bring it in completely.
Which raises the question, would the Freudian critique be powerful for all the elements? That'd be an interesting question. I mean, in a way, I would think that he would appreciate what I'm calling the logical elements. Is it possible to say that the Freudian critique would not apply up to a level of specificity and repetition? It's an interesting question. Your assumption might be, I'm not sure this is what you really mean, is that if we applied the Freudian critique, well, maybe you're just asking, look, if you're going to apply the critique
Or here's the continuum. We apply it at 20% or at 80% across the board. We don't apply it 20% in chapter 3 and 80% in chapter 5.
Unless would take a lot of clarification, wouldn't it? What is the Freudian critique? Let's get clear on that. And then apply it to the elements of Leviticus where it seems salient.
When does devotion, the tipping point from devotion to obsessiveness happen?
Because I think we might agree that Freud would not be critical in a thoroughgoing way. He might have his biases and he doesn't like the whole Levitical idea. But now when you get down to specific elements of his critique, I take it that it would apply strongly here and not strongly there.
Yes, and there's some, it's okay to have purity of washing hands in certain ways, but then people that wash their hands 20, 30 times because of this, there's a continuum there, right?
And your point is that when I applied it, it wasn't done thoughtfully.
Or it was done of something that bothers my 21st century liberal Jewish values, of pointing these people out as having defects.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what. I feel that it was merely what I'm calling the obsessive interest in details at some point.
I see that as just helpful guidelines for people. It's all spelled
There you
out.
go. Wow.
Okay.
So now we have to spend a lot of time going through the Freudian literature. But it's a very good point, really. It's so easy, even the attempt to get back to how they were feeling and not us, and then also arbitrarily leaping to some view from modernity.
Yes, yeah.
It seemed, what's the word here? It seemed, arbitrary.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that I see the setup. I'm glad you read Psalm 50, all right? Because in the setup it says, okay, no shaving, no cutting, all of these pagan things coming in, including animal sacrifice, except that I see that the priest had a very utilitarian perspective on, we better keep that animal sacrifice or we're not going to be able to eat. All right, so...
Was it, you think Psalm 50 is against animal sacrifice or against thinking about it in terms of God's food?
Oh, thinking about God's food, which is correct, which makes sense, okay, then why is it still in there? Well, it's still in there because the utilitarian need overcame getting rid of all these antiquated, pagan, alien beliefs that we're not going to follow anymore, or we're just going to say that's the other and this is us and we're different.
When you say utilitarian need, it's as if, the assumption is, and it might be true, that there is some function fulfilled by thinking of it as God's food, rather than an atavism which slipped in.
No, the utilitarianism is, we didn't get a piece of land like all the tribes. How are we going to feed ourselves? Well, we're gonna take a little of this sacrifice, and some of it we're going to eat ourselves, and therefore we're going to be able to feed ourselves and our families. But that's the utilitarian part, not not with God, but, not feeding God, but the priests feeding themselves.
And what about feeding God in that passage?
No, I don't,